Staring at an empty chair, Arthur Castellano sat frozen at the defense table. A man whose mere whisper could paralyze the city's underworld was now completely exposed, his legendary attorney having vanished into thin air. Suddenly, a sharp crack of the gavel snapped through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like a gunshot. With an $800 million asset seizure and a career-making conviction on the line, the ruthless federal prosecutor was ready to pounce. The defense had exactly 2 minutes to present their case or forfeit an empire, yet the senior partners remained paralyzed. Then, clutching a stack of heavily redacted files, a 24-year-old intern slowly stood up. She wasn't supposed to speak, but she was about to change Chicago's history forever. The offices of Harrington, Pierce, and Reed occupied the top 3 floors of the Aon Center, a monument to corporate power and exorbitant legal billing overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the 64th floor was humming with a frantic, suffocating panic. Samantha Sullivan, a third-year law student at Northwestern, sat cross-legged on the floor of the main conference room. She was surrounded by thousands of pages of financial records, bank statements from the Cayman Islands, and wiretap transcripts. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy knot, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her hazel eyes scanning lines of code that represented shell companies. She was exhausted, fueled only by stale coffee and the adrenaline of sheer proximity to the firm's biggest case in a decade. The client was Arthur Castellano. On paper, Arthur was the CEO of Castellano Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar shipping and real estate conglomerate. In reality, the Department of Justice alleged he was the undisputed head of the Chicago Syndicate. He was a phantom, a man who never left fingerprints, never sent emails, and never raised his voice. But the feds, led by the aggressively ambitious federal prosecutor Thomas Cavanaugh, had finally found a vulnerability. They weren't trying to lock Arthur up on a RICO criminal charge. They knew witnesses tended to develop sudden amnesia. Instead, they were going after his lifeblood, an $800 million civil asset forfeiture. They aimed to seize his accounts, his properties, his fleet of ships, paralyzing his organization overnight. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the trial of the decade was set to begin. There was only one problem. Harrison Reed, the firm's senior partner and the only attorney formidable enough to go toe-to-toe with the federal government on this case, was missing. "What do you mean, straight to voicemail?" snapped Richard Pierce, a sweating, red-faced junior partner, pacing the length of the conference table. "He's been MIA since 4 o'clock this afternoon. Harrison doesn't just go dark 12 hours before a billion-dollar trial. We've called his cell, his private line, his driver," an associate stammered, holding a tablet like a shield. "His doorman said he left his Gold Coast penthouse at 3:30 p.m. He got into a black sedan, not his usual town car. We haven't heard a word since." Samantha looked up from her documents, her stomach tightening. She had spent the last 6 months as Harrison's shadow. She was nothing but a glorified paralegal in the eyes of the partners, an intern desperate to pay off her mounting student loans, but Harrison had noticed her razor-sharp memory. He had practically chained her to the Castellano file, making her memorize every transaction, every corporate veil, every offshore proxy. "Has anyone called the hospitals?" Samantha asked quietly, her voice cutting through the rising panic. Richard glared at her. "Yes, Sullivan. We called the hospitals. We called the precinct captains. Nothing." It's like he evaporated. Richard dragged a hand down his face, smearing sweat across his forehead. "If Harrison doesn't walk into that courtroom tomorrow, Castellano is going to murder us. I mean that literally. He will have us killed." "He's a businessman, Richard," Samantha said, organizing a stack of deposition summaries. "He doesn't kill his lawyers. It's bad for the portfolio." "You don't know him," Richard hissed. "You just push the paper. You haven't sat across from those ice-cold eyes. The man is a predator in a bespoke suit." Samantha didn't argue, but she silently disagreed. She had been in the room during Arthur Castellano's consultations. While the senior partners sweated and groveled, she had observed him. Arthur was 34, brutally handsome, with sharp aristocratic features and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He possessed a terrifying quiet gravity. He never threatened, he didn't need to. But what fascinated Samantha wasn't his power, it was his intellect. During the prep sessions, while Harrison droned on about legal precedents, Arthur had occasionally locked eyes with Samantha. It was a fleeting, assessing gaze, as if he knew she was the only one in the room who actually understood the intricate financial web the feds were trying to untangle. By 3 a.m., the panic in the firm had crystallized into a grim, fatalistic dread. Harrison Reed was officially a ghost. Richard Pierce, trembling, made the executive decision. We file for a continuance, first thing in the morning. We tell Judge Maxwell there's a medical emergency. Maxwell hates us, an associate countered. He's been trying to nail Castellano for years. He'll deny it. He'll force us to proceed, or he'll grant a default judgment for the prosecution. Then I'll stand up and stall, Richard said, though his voice lacked any conviction. Samantha looked down at the central file, the cull switch, Harrison called it. It was a specific sequence of bank transfers from a subsidiary called Vesper Holdings. The feds claimed Vesper was Castellano's money laundering hub. Harrison's entire defense rested on proving Vesper was a completely independent entity. Samantha had organized the defense, but she had noticed something deeply unsettling in Harrison's final notes earlier that week. Something didn't add up. But as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a bloody orange glow across the office, there was no time to question Harrison's strategy. They had to survive the morning. The marble steps of the Jerkson Federal Courthouse felt like the steps to a guillotine. It was 8:15 a.m. The Chicago wind was biting, whipping Samantha's trench coat around her legs as she lugged a massive leather briefcase up the stairs, trailing behind Richard Pierce and two other panicked partners. The plaza was swarming with reporters, camera crews, and heavily armed federal marshals. The Castellano trial was a media circus. "Keep your heads down," Richard muttered, his face pale, eyes darting around as flashbulbs exploded in their faces. "Say nothing." They bypassed the press and entered the echoing rotunda, making their way to the private consultation rooms outside courtroom 4B. They had exactly 45 minutes before Judge Maxwell took the bench. "Where is he?" A low, baritone voice echoed from the end of the corridor. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Samantha stopped in her tracks. Emerging from the shadows of the corridor was Arthur Castellano. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that seemed to absorb the light, paired with a crisp white shirt and a midnight blue tie. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man entirely comfortable with violence, flanked by two massive men whose suits bulged slightly at the chest. Arthur's ice-blue eyes swept over the terrified legal team. He didn't yell, he didn't sneer, but the sheer force of his presence pinned them to the wall. His gaze finally settled on Richard Pierce, who looked as though he might faint. "I am paying your firm an obscene amount of money for Harrison Reed," Arthur said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. "So, Richard, explain to me why I am looking at you and not the man who is supposed to save $800 million of my assets." "Mr. Castellano," Richard choked out, stepping back. We have a situation. Harrison is indisposed. We believe he may have suffered a medical emergency. We've been trying to locate him all night." Arthur stepped closer. He was at least 6'3", towering over Richard. Indisposed. On the morning of a federal seizure trial, Arthur tilted his head. "Are you telling me my lead counsel has vanished?" "We are going to request a continuance, Arthur." "Judge Maxwell will deny it," Arthur interrupted, his tone razor sharp. "Kavanaugh will push for immediate proceedings, claiming we are stalling to move the funds offshore. If we don't present a defense today, they seize the accounts by noon. Everything freezes. I can step in, Richard stammered, wiping his brow. I can read Harrison's opening statement. Arthur stared at Richard for a long, agonizing moment. Then Arthur's eyes shifted. He looked past the sweating partners and locked onto Samantha, who was standing quietly in the back, gripping the leather briefcase to her chest. You, Arthur said softly. The partners turned to look at her. Samantha swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mr. Castellano, Richard quickly interjected. That is Miss Sullivan. She's just an intern. A student. Arthur ignored Richard entirely. He walked slowly toward Samantha, the two bodyguards stepping back to give him space. He stopped just inches away from her. The scent of bergamot, cedar, and something uniquely electric enveloped her. Up close, his eyes weren't just cold. They were incredibly intense, calculating every micro-expression on her face. You're the one who found the discrepancy in the Vesper Holdings audit last month, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. Samantha blinked in surprise. She had brought that discrepancy up to Harrison in private. She had no idea Arthur even knew her name, let alone her contributions. Yes, sir, she managed to say, forcing her voice to remain steady. Harrison told me you have a photographic memory for financial ledgers, Arthur continued, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again. He said you were the only reason he understood the Cayman shell structures. I know the files, Mr. Castellano. I organized the entire defense. Arthur stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a hypnotic whisper meant only for her. Richard is terrified. If he stands up in there, Kavanaugh will eat him alive, and I will lose my empire. Are you terrified, Miss Sullivan? Samantha looked into the eyes of Chicago's most dangerous man. Her career, her life, her future were hanging by a thread. But beneath the fear, an unexpected fire flared in her chest. She had spent 3 years in law school being talked over by men like Richard. She knew this case better than the prosecutor. She knew every loophole. I'm terrified of losing, Samantha said, her chin lifting slightly. But I'm not terrified of Kavanaugh. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smirk pulled at the corner of Arthur's mouth. Good. He turned back to Richard. The intern speaks for me today. Arthur, that is insanity, Richard exploded, forgetting himself. She hasn't passed the bar. She can't legally represent you in federal court without a supervising attorney. Then you will sit next to her, Richard, Arthur commanded, his voice turning into a whip crack. You will be her puppet. You will sign whatever needs signing, and you will sponsor her pro hoc vice or whatever loophole you need to use as a student practitioner. But she drives the car, or I promise you, Richard, the loss of my assets will be the second worst thing to happen to you today. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the floor and nodded. Arthur turned his attention back to Samantha. The intimidating aura softened by a fraction, replaced by a strange, heavy intimacy. $800 million, Miss Sullivan. My life's work. It's in your hands now. Don't drop it. Courtroom 4B was a grand theater of mahogany and stained glass, packed to the brim with journalists, federal agents, and curious spectators. The air was thick with anticipation. Samantha sat at the defense table, feeling the weight of 100 stares burning into her back. To her left sat Richard Pierce, practically vibrating with anxiety. To her right sat Arthur Castellano. He was the calmest person in the room, casually leaning back in his leather chair, exuding absolute dominance despite the fact that the federal government was closing its jaws around him. At the prosecution table, Thomas Kavanaugh stood up. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a shark-like smile. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Maxwell, a stern, unsmiling man with a reputation for merciless rulings, took the bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table, his brow furrowing. Mr. Pierce. Where is Mr. Reed? I was expecting him to lead the circus today. Richard stood up, his knees visibly shaking. Your Honor, Mr. Reed has suffered an unforeseen medical emergency. We request a 48-hour continuance. Kavanaugh immediately jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is a classic delay tactic. The defense knows that if we don't proceed today, the international freeze orders expire, and Mr. Castellano will transfer the disputed $800 million into untouchable sovereign accounts. The government demands we proceed, or we request a summary judgment. Judge Maxwell banged his gavel. Continuance denied, Mr. Pierce. You are a senior partner. You will represent your client, or I will rule in favor of the prosecution. Richard swallowed hard. Your Honor, the defense will proceed. However, under the state's student practice rule, I am formally sponsoring Samantha Sullivan, a third-year law student, to present the opening arguments and handle the evidentiary review under my direct supervision. A murmur of shock rippled through the gallery. Kavanaugh laughed out loud. An intern, Your Honor. The defense is putting an intern on an $800 million RICO forfeiture? It is entirely legal, Your Honor, Samantha said, standing up. Her voice, initially slightly shaky, resonated through the microphone. She smoothed down her skirt, forced her shoulders back, and met the judge's eyes. I am intimately familiar with the financial documents in question. Judge Maxwell looked from Samantha to Arthur Castellano. Arthur simply nodded once. The judge sighed. Very well. If the defense wishes to commit legal suicide, I won't stop them. Proceed. Samantha opened her briefcase and pulled out Harrison Reed's meticulously prepared trial binder. She had reviewed this opening statement a dozen times. The strategy was simple. Deny that Castellano Logistics had any controlling interest in Vesper Holdings. Kavanaugh delivered a blistering opening statement, painting Arthur as a ruthless kingpin using Vesper Holdings to launder money from illegal gambling and racketeering. He promised to show the court a direct money trail linking Castellano's personal accounts to Vesper's offshore holdings. When it was Samantha's turn, she walked to the podium. She felt Arthur's eyes tracking her every movement. It was a heavy, grounding anchor amidst the chaos. She looked down at Harrison's notes. Page 1, introduce the corporate veil. Page 2, highlight the lack of direct wire transfers. But as she stared at the printed words, a sudden, horrifying realization washed over her. Last night, when she had reviewed the cull switch files, she noticed a discrepancy. Harrison had instructed her to submit a specific batch of financial disclosures to the prosecution during discovery. At the time, she didn't question it. But now, piecing together Kavanaugh's smugness and Harrison's mysterious disappearance, the pieces of a terrifying puzzle snapped into place. Harrison's defense wasn't designed to win. It was a trap. If Samantha read Harrison's prepared statement and denied the connection to Vesper Holdings, Kavanaugh would instantly produce the very documents Harrison had slipped into the discovery pile documents that contained a hidden, fatal flaw proving Castellano did control Vesper. It was perjury. It was a slam dunk for the prosecution. Harrison Reed hadn't disappeared because of a medical emergency. He had been bought. He had sold Arthur Castellano to the feds and fled the city. Samantha stopped breathing for a second. The silence in the courtroom stretched. Miss Sullivan, Judge Maxwell prompted impatiently. We are waiting. Samantha looked back at the defense table. Arthur was watching her. He noticed the slight hesitation, the widening of her eyes. His jaw clenched, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She couldn't use Harrison's defense. If she did, Arthur would lose everything. She had to pivot. She had to invent a completely new legal strategy for an $800 million case, live in front of a federal judge with zero preparation. Samantha closed Harrison Reed's binder. She deliberately pushed it aside, leaving the podium bare. A collective gasp echoed from the press box. Your Honor, Samantha began, her voice ringing out clear and strong, the fear completely evaporating, replaced by a razor-sharp adrenaline. The prosecution has just spent 20 minutes spinning a fascinating fiction about Vesper Holdings. They intend to prove that my client, Mr. Castellano, secretly controls this entity. She took a slow, measured step away from the podium, walking right up to the jury box. We are not going to deny that Castellano Logistics transferred funds to Vesper Holdings, Samantha said. Behind her, Richard Pierce let out a strangled gasp. Pavanaugh's smug smile vanished, replaced by utter confusion. Even Arthur shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. She had just admitted to the core of the government's case. We admit the transfers occurred, Samantha continued, her eyes locking onto Kavanaugh. But we are not here to defend a money laundering operation. We are here to expose the fact that Department of Justice star witness, the man who provided them with the financial logs of Vesper Holdings, committed massive corporate fraud and embezzled those funds from my client. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Arthur. He was staring at her, an expression of dark, intense admiration dawning on his face. He realized exactly what she was doing. She was turning the government's trap into a weapon against them. My client isn't the architect of a criminal syndicate, Samantha declared, her voice echoing with absolute authority. He is the victim of a sophisticated financial theft, orchestrated by a rogue executive, and we have the paper trail to prove that the government's $800 million seizure is based entirely on fabricated evidence provided by a thief. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. The intern had just set the trial on fire. The gavel slammed down repeatedly, the sharp, percussive cracks barely cutting through the uproar that had swallowed courtroom 4B. Reporters were frantically whispering into their phones, while the gallery buzzed with a deafening mix of shock and outrage. At the prosecution table, Thomas Kavanaugh's face had drained of all color before flushing a violent, mottled red. "Order! I will have order in this court, or I will clear the gallery!" Judge Maxwell roared, his face rigid with fury. He glared down at the 24-year-old law student who had just detonated a bomb in his courtroom. "Miss Sullivan, you are treading on incredibly thin ice. You cannot introduce a completely new, unvetted theory of defense during opening statements. The government has had no time to review this so-called embezzlement." Kavanaugh leapt to his feet, stabbing a finger in the air. "It is a complete fabrication, Your Honor. This is trial by ambush. The defense submitted no evidence during discovery indicating that David Croft, our key witness, was involved in embezzlement. This intern is grandstanding to taint the jury pool and stall the freeze order. I demand she be held in contempt." Samantha didn't flinch. She gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white. "Your Honor, the prosecution's entire forfeiture claim relies on the financial ledgers of Vesper Holdings, provided by their star witness, former Castellano Logistics CFO, David Croft. Mr. Kavanaugh entered those ledgers into evidence under the premise that they reflect my client's actions. If the government's own evidence is fraudulent, manipulated by the very witness they intend to call, the defense has an absolute constitutional right to impeach that witness." She paused, taking a breath to steady her racing heart. "Furthermore, the defense did submit the relevant financial discrepancies during discovery. They were buried in a data dump of over 40,000 pages of internal audits performed by PricewaterhouseCoopers last fiscal year. The prosecution simply failed to notice them. That is not an ambush, Your Honor. That is a failure of the prosecution to read the files." A murmur of genuine shock rippled through the press box. Kavanaugh looked momentarily paralyzed, his mind racing to recall the thousands of pages of POC audits his paralegals had skimmed over. Judge Maxwell narrowed his eyes, clearly torn between his disdain for Castellano and his strict adherence to legal procedure. He looked at the clock above the double doors. It was 10:15 a.m. "We are taking a 30-minute recess," Judge Maxwell snapped. "Mr. Kavanaugh, I suggest you consult your discovery files. Miss Sullivan, if you cannot back up this staggering accusation with hard, irrefutable paper when we return, I will grant a summary judgment for the government, and I will personally see to it that you never pass the Illinois bar." "Court is in recess." As the judge swept out of the room, the tension shattered into frantic movement. Samantha practically collapsed back into her chair, her legs suddenly feeling like water. She had done it. She had bought them 30 minutes. A heavy, warm hand clamped down on her shoulder. She turned to see Arthur Castellano standing over her. The mask of polite corporate indifference he wore for the jury was gone. In its place was something feral, dark, and terrifyingly intense. "Conference room, now," Arthur ordered. 3 minutes later, they were in the soundproofed attorney quiet holding cell down the hall. Richard Pierce scurried in behind them, sweating profusely and clutching his chest as if he were having a mild coronary. "Are you insane?" Richard screamed, spinning on Samantha the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut. "Embezzlement? Fraud? Where did you pull that from? You just guaranteed a summary judgment against us. You have destroyed this firm. Get out," Arthur said softly. Richard froze, blinking. "Arthur, we need to do damage control." "I said get out, Richard," Arthur repeated, not raising his voice, but the lethal undercurrent in his tone made the air in the small room feel suffocatingly thin. "Wait in the hall. If you speak to the press, I will cut your tongue out." Richard swallowed a whimper, turned and scrambled out of the room, shutting the door tightly behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Samantha's shallow breathing. Arthur slowly turned to face her. He walked toward her, closing the distance until she was backed up against the edge of the small wooden conference table. He braced a hand on the table beside her hip, trapping her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smelling the faint scent of rain and expensive cologne. "Harrison set me up," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact from a man who had just put the pieces together. Samantha looked up into his icy blue eyes, forcing herself not to look away. "Yes, I saw his final notes on the Vesper files last night. He deliberately slipped an unredacted Swift transfer log into the discovery pile. It was a kill switch. If I had read his defense strategy, Kavanaugh would have cross-referenced it with the unredacted log, proving you had direct control of the Cayman National Bank accounts. You would have committed perjury the moment I opened my mouth." Arthur's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The betrayal of his most trusted legal advisor was a massive blow, but his focus was entirely on the young woman standing in front of him. "And instead of walking away," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register, "instead of letting Richard take the fall, you stood up in front of a federal judge and painted a target on the back of the Department of Justice star witness, without a shred of prepared evidence." "I have the evidence," Samantha countered, her voice trembling slightly, though not from fear of the case. The proximity of this dangerous, powerful man was doing strange things to her nervous system. "I memorized the POC audits, Arthur. I know exactly where the money went. David Croft didn't just hand the ledgers over to the feds. He altered them to cover his own tracks before he sought immunity. He stole your money, and he's using the federal government to legitimize the theft." Arthur stared at her, his eyes darkening with a potent mix of awe, predatory possessiveness, and genuine shock. In his world, loyalty was bought with blood or money, and even then it was fragile. This 24-year-old law student owed him nothing. She was earning minimum wage at a cutthroat firm, yet she had just thrown herself onto a grenade to save his empire. He slowly lifted his hand, his knuckles brushing against her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle for a man with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Samantha's breath hitched. "Do you understand what you've done, Samantha?" he asked softly, using her first name for the first time. The way it rolled off his tongue sent a shiver down her spine. "By burning Harrison's trap, you didn't just save my assets. You made yourself a player in a game you don't fully understand." "I understand, I'm your lawyer," she said fiercely, refusing to back down. "And I don't lose." A slow, devastating smirk spread across Arthur's face. The terrifying mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man deeply, undeniably captivated. "No, you don't." He stepped back, pulling his phone from his inner suit pocket. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dominic, I need you to track down Harrison Reed. Check the private charters out of Midway and Gary airports. He's running. Bring him to me." He hung up the phone and buttoned his jacket, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the cold, untouchable kingpin. 30 minutes are up, counselor, Arthur said, gesturing toward the door. Let's go destroy a federal witness. The courtroom was stiflingly quiet as David Croft took the witness stand. Croft was a man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp Armani suit, sporting a deep tan that spoke of winters spent in St. Mons, Bart's rather than Chicago. He looked confident, almost arrogant, as he swore an oath on the Bible. With a federal immunity deal securely in his pocket, he believed he was bulletproof. Thomas Kavanaugh spent the first 20 minutes of direct examination establishing Croft's credentials. He walked the former CFO through the intricate structure of Castellano Logistics, slowly building a narrative of a legitimate shipping empire being used as a front for the Chicago syndicate's illicit cash flow. And Mr. Croft, Kavanaugh asked, pacing confidently in front of the jury box, who gave the direct orders to transfer funds from the domestic operating accounts to the offshore entities managed by Vesper Holdings? Arthur Castellano, Croft replied smoothly, not even glancing at the defense table. He held the sole authorization keys. Every cent that moved into the Cayman accounts was done at his explicit, verbal direction. Thank you, Mr. Croft. No further questions, Kavanaugh said, shooting a triumphant sneer at Samantha. Judge Maxwell looked down from the bench. Your witness, Miss Sullivan, and remember my warning. Samantha stood up. She didn't bring a notepad. She didn't bring a binder. She walked to the podium empty-handed, adjusting the microphone. The sheer audacity of her stance made Croft shift uncomfortably in his seat. Good morning, Mr. Croft, Samantha began, her voice perfectly even. You testified that Mr. Castellano held the sole authorization keys for the Vesper transfers, correct? That is correct, Croft replied, offering a patronizing smile. And these transfers were executed digitally using a secure internal network? Yes, Mr. Hub. Croft, are you familiar with the security protocols of the Castellano Logistics internal servers? Specifically, the IP tracking software implemented by the IT department in 2024? Croft's patronizing smile faltered slightly. I was the CFO, Miss Sullivan. I dealt with the finances, not the IT infrastructure. Of course, Samantha said smoothly. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to direct the witness's attention to Defense Exhibit C, a document retrieved from the prosecution's own discovery file. Specifically, page 4212 of the PricewaterhouseCoopers internal audit from last October. Kavanaugh scrambled through his digital files on his laptop, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The bailiff handed a printed document to Croft. Mr. Croft, Samantha said, her voice dropping the polite facade, becoming sharp and authoritative. Can you read the IP address logged for the $80 million transfer to Vesper Holdings on November 14th? Croft stared at the paper, his tan suddenly looking a little less healthy. It's a string of numbers? I don't know what it means. I'll help you, Samantha offered coldly. That IP address does not match the secure servers at Castellano Logistics headquarters. In fact, a routine tracer route included in the appendix of that very same audit shows that the IP address belongs to a private encrypted router. She paused, letting the silence hang. A router located at a ski chalet in Aspen, Colorado, a property owned by your wife's shell company, Peakview LLC. Isn't that correct, Mr. Croft? A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Kavanaugh shot up. Objection. Relevance. It goes to the core of the witness's credibility, Your Honor, Samantha fired back, not breaking eye contact with Croft. He claims my client made the transfers. The digital footprint proves the transfers were made from the witness's own living room while he was allegedly on a 2-week medical leave. Overruled. The witness will answer, Judge Maxwell commanded, leaning forward, his interest suddenly piqued. I frequently worked from home, Croft stammered, wiping his mouth. Arthur would call me and instruct me to make the transfers remotely. Really? Samantha tilted her head, her mind instantly recalling another piece of the puzzle. Let's talk about where that money went after it hit Vesper Holdings. You testified it was funneled into Mr. Castellano's private accounts at Cayman National Bank. But let's look at Defense Exhibit D, page 6,800 of the discovery file. Another document was handed to Croft. His hands were visibly shaking now. This is a routing ledger from a J.P. Morgan Chase clearinghouse, Samantha explained to the jury. It tracks the exact $80 million that left your Aspen chalet. But it didn't go to the Cayman Islands, did it, Mr. Croft? The SWIFT codes show the funds were diverted, split into 5 separate microtransactions, and routed to a private banking division at UBS in Geneva, Switzerland. Samantha took a step closer to the witness stand. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the judge was holding his breath. Mr. Croft, do you know who holds the beneficial ownership of that UBS account in Geneva? Objection, Kavanaugh shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The defense is testifying. I am asking a question, Your Honor, Samantha said calmly. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Croft, Judge Maxwell demanded, his tone turning venomous. Croft was hyperventilating, staring at the document as if it were a venomous snake. I decline to answer under my Fifth Amendment rights. You waived your Fifth Amendment rights regarding the Vesper transactions when you signed your immunity deal, Mr. Croft, Judge Maxwell warned. Answer the question, or I will hold you in contempt and void your federal protection. Croft looked at Kavanaugh, pleading for help, but the prosecutor looked utterly defeated. I don't know, Croft whispered. You don't know? Samantha's voice cracked like a whip. Then, allow me to refresh your memory. The account is registered to a corporate entity called Horizon Consulting. The sole managing director of Horizon Consulting is a man named Julian Croft. Your brother. Pandemonium erupted. The gallery exploded into shouts. Reporters leaped over the benches, racing for the doors to broadcast the bombshell. Judge Maxwell slammed his gavel, his face purple with rage. Order, order in my court. The judge pointed his gavel at Kavanaugh. Counselor, did you or did you not verify the beneficiary accounts of your star witness before bringing this forfeiture to my courtroom? Your Honor, we relied on the sworn affidavits. You relied on a perjurer to steal $800 million from a U.S. citizen, Maxwell bellowed. He turned his furious gaze to Croft. Bailiff, take Mr. Croft into custody for federal perjury and fraud. Mr. Kavanaugh, your forfeiture motion is denied with extreme prejudice. The freeze orders on Mr. Castellano's accounts are lifted immediately. This case is dismissed. The gavel slammed down one final, definitive time. Samantha stood frozen at the podium, the adrenaline rushing out of her system, leaving her dizzy and breathless. The roar of the courtroom faded into background static. She had actually done it. She had defeated the federal government and saved an empire without breaking a single law. Suddenly, a hand wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against a solid, tailored chest. Arthur Castellano turned her to face him, oblivious to the flashing cameras and the shouting press. His eyes were burning with a dark, triumphant fire. He didn't say a word about the money. He didn't care about the lifted freeze orders. He was looking at her like she was the most intoxicating, dangerous thing he had ever seen. You're not an intern anymore, Arthur whispered, his lips grazing her ear, sending an electric shock straight down her spine. You're mine. But as he pulled her through the chaotic throng of reporters toward the courthouse exit, Samantha caught sight of a television monitor in the lobby. A breaking news ticker crawled across the bottom of the screen. Breaking. Body of prominent defense attorney Harrison Reed found in abandoned vehicle near Gary, Indiana. The victory turned to ash in Samantha's mouth. The trial was over, but the war had just begun. The breaking news ticker on the lobby monitor felt like a physical blow to Samantha's chest. Body of prominent defense attorney Harrison Reed found an abandoned vehicle near Gary, Indiana. The deafening roar of the press corps faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She stopped walking, her eyes glued to the screen. Harrison was dead. The man who had mentored her, used her, and ultimately tried to frame her new client to save his own skin was gone. "Keep moving," Arthur murmured, his hand a firm, unyielding vice on the small of her back. He didn't even glance at the television. He simply steered her through the blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras and the shouting journalists, his two massive bodyguards parting the sea of people like an icebreaker through a frozen lake. They burst through the heavy glass doors of the Dirksen courthouse and into the biting Chicago wind. A sleek, armored black Maybach was waiting at the curb, its engine purring with a low, menacing hum. Dominic, Arthur's towering right-hand man, held the rear door open. Arthur ushered Samantha inside before sliding in next to her. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic noise of the plaza instantly, leaving them in a thick, soundproof cocoon of leather and tinted glass. "Drive," Arthur commanded. As the Maybach pulled smoothly into the downtown traffic, Samantha finally found her voice. It was trembling, betraying the sheer terror crashing down through her fading adrenaline. "Did you kill him?" She turned to look at Arthur. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket and loosened his midnight blue tie, looking relaxed, almost bored, as if they had just left a mundane corporate merger rather than a federal trial that ended in an $800 million victory and a murder. "I told you," Arthur said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "I am a businessman, Samantha. Killing my own lead counsel on the morning of a federal seizure trial is bad for the portfolio. It draws the very attention I pay millions to avoid." "Then who did?" she demanded, her hands shaking as she clutched her leather briefcase. Arthur leaned over to the built-in mahogany console between them. He poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25 into a crystal tumbler and handed it to her. She took it, the amber liquid splashing slightly against the glass. "Drink," he instructed softly. "You're in shock." She took a sip. The whiskey burned a fiery trail down her throat, grounding her slightly. "Harrison didn't just sell me out to the feds," Arthur explained, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. "The Department of Justice doesn't have the budget or the leverage to make a partner at Harrington. Pearson Reed disappear. Harrison was bought by the Rossi family. Carlo Rossi has been trying to absorb my shipping routes along the Great Lakes for 3 years. Rossi paid David Croft to embezzle my funds, and he paid Harrison to make sure the feds seize my remaining assets today. Once it was paralyzed by the government, Rossi would have moved in and slaughtered my people." Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. "But Harrison failed. Because of me." "Exactly," Arthur said, a dark, chilling smile touching his lips. "Harrison's trap failed. The freeze orders were lifted. Rossi's $800 million coup collapsed on national television. In Rossi's world, failure is not met with a severance package. Harrison was a liability who knew too much. Rossi tied up a loose end before I could get to him." The reality of the situation wrapped around Samantha's throat like a titan snare. She wasn't just a law student who had won a case. She had just publicly humiliated a rival mafia syndicate and dismantled their multi-million-dollar conspiracy. "They're going to come after me," Samantha whispered, the glass trembling in her hand. Arthur took the tumbler from her, setting it on the console. Before she could protest, he reached out, his large, warm hands framing her face. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones, his touch sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core, momentarily overriding her terror. "No one is going to touch a single hair on your head," Arthur vowed, his voice dropping to a fierce territorial growl. "You belong to me now. You saved my empire, Samantha. You outsmarted the federal government, you outsmarted a corrupt CFO, and you outsmarted a rival syndicate, all without breaking a single law. You are the most brilliant, dangerous woman I have ever met." The raw intensity in his eyes stripped away the final remnants of her composure. The fear melted into an intoxicating, reckless desire. She had spent her entire life playing by the rules, keeping her head down, suffocating under student debt and the condescension of men like Richard Pierce. Today she had tasted absolute unadulterated power, and the man holding her was offering her the keys to the kingdom. "What happens now?" she breathed, leaning slightly into his touch. "I am taking you to my private residence at the peninsula," Arthur replied, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I am going to post heavily armed guards at every elevator, bank, and stairwell. And then I am going to make you an offer." "An offer?" "You can take a $10 million bonus for your work today," Arthur said smoothly, though a muscle feathered in his jaw, betraying his tension. "I will set you up with a new identity, a new life anywhere in the world, far away from Carlo Rossi and the Chicago Syndicate. You will be safe, wealthy, and free." Samantha swallowed hard. "And the second option?" Arthur leaned in closer, his lips mere inches from hers. The scent of bergamot and danger enveloped her completely. "You stay, you step into the dark with me. You become my consigliere, the undisputed head of my legal division. We buy out your old firm, we crush the Rossi family, and we rule this city together." He didn't need to say anything else. The choice wasn't just about a job, it was about surrendering to the undeniable magnetic pull between them. It was a blood pact. Samantha looked deep into his eyes. She thought of the empty, sterile life of a corporate associate, drafting contracts for ungrateful partners until she was 60. Then she thought of the thrill of the courtroom today, the fire in her veins, and the terrifying, beautiful man who recognized her true potential. She reached up, her hands sliding into the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, and pulled him the rest of the way in. When their lips met, it wasn't a tentative spark, it was an explosion. Arthur kissed her with the same ruthless, consuming passion that he applied to his empire. His arms wrapped her around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, crushing the breath from her lungs. Samantha kissed him back, pouring every ounce of her remaining adrenaline, fear, and triumph into it. She tangled her fingers in his dark hair, tasting the expensive scotch on his tongue, completely surrendering to the intoxicating darkness he offered. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. A low, triumphant chuckle vibrated in his chest. "I'll take that as a resignation from your internship," he murmured. "I'm going to need a corner office," Samantha replied, a wicked smile spreading across her face. 2 weeks later, the 64th floor of the Aeon Center was eerily quiet. The offices of Harrington, Pierce, and Reed had been in a state of mourning and utter panic since the discovery of Harrison Reed's body. The firm was hemorrhaging clients, terrified by the implications of a senior partner being murdered in connection to a mob trial. Richard Pierce was currently hiding in his office, aggressively chewing on an antacid tablet, staring at a stack of resignation letters from his junior associates. The firm was weeks away from bankruptcy. The heavy glass doors of the reception area swung open. Richard's secretary, a stern woman named Martha, looked up from her desk and gasped. Walking through the doors was Samantha Sullivan. She wasn't wearing her usual wrinkled intern trench coat or flat shoes. She was wearing a flawless, tailored Tom Ford suit in charcoal gray, her blonde hair styled in an immaculate blowout, a pair of Christian Louboutin heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. Flanking her were Dominic and another massive stone-faced bodyguard. She walked straight past reception, ignoring Martha's stammering, and pushed open the double doors to Richard Pierce's office without knocking. Richard jumped, spilling his cup of coffee across his desk. "Sullivan, what is the meaning of this? You haven't been at work in 2 weeks. You're fired. And who are these men?" Samantha calmly walked over to the leather guest chair and sat down, crossing her legs. She placed a single thick manila folder on Richard's desk, right on top of his spilled coffee. "I'm not fired, Richard," Samantha said, her voice dripping with the kind of cool, terrifying authority she had learned from the man who now shared her bed. "Because you don't own this firm anymore." Richard stared at her, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? Open the file. With trembling hands, Richard peeled back the wet manila cover. Inside was a fully executed acquisition contract. A shell company named Vesper Vanguard Management had purchased the controlling shares of Harrington, Pierce, and Reed's debt from their primary creditors. The firm had been subjected to a hostile takeover. Vesper Vanguard, Richard whispered, the blood draining from his face as he recognized the name. Castellano. Arthur sends his regards, Samantha smiled sweetly. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the firm has been restructured. Arthur is our sole client. We are moving entirely to private wealth protection and aggressive defense litigation for Castellano Logistics. Richard sank back into his chair, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to the electric chair. You bought the firm. I am the new managing partner, Samantha corrected him. And you, Richard, are going to be my senior associate. You will handle the mundane tax filings and real estate zoning permits. If you try to resign, or if you ever speak to the federal government about the inner workings of this office, Dominic here will have a very brief, very permanent conversation with you. Do we understand each other? Richard looked at the towering bodyguard, then back to the 24-year-old law student who had just conquered his entire world. He swallowed hard and nodded slowly. Yes, Miss Sullivan. Good. Samantha stood up, smoothing her jacket. Have Harrison's old corner office cleared out and sanitized by noon? I want the mahogany desk replaced with glass. And get me a double espresso. She turned and walked out of the office, the two bodyguards falling into step behind her. As she reached the lobby, the private elevator chimed. The door slid open, revealing Arthur Castellano. He was leaning against the polished steel wall, looking dangerously handsome in a bespoke black suit. He took in the sight of her the power she radiated, the absolute control she had just exerted over the men who used to treat her like garbage. A slow, devastating smirk spread across his face. He stepped out of the elevator and offered her his hand. How does it feel? Arthur asked, his voice a gravelly whisper meant only for her. Samantha slid her hand into his, feeling the familiar, thrilling electric spark. She stepped into the elevator with the most dangerous man in Chicago, the man who had given her the world, and the man she would burn the city to the ground to protect. It feels, Samantha smiled, the door sliding shut, like we have a city to run. What a journey! From a panicked, overworked law student buried in files to the reigning queen of Chicago's underworld, Samantha Sullivan proved that sometimes the most dangerous player in the room is the one nobody notices. She didn't just save Arthur Castellano's $800 million empire. She outmaneuvered the federal government, exposed a corrupt witness, and claimed her rightful throne beside the city's most formidable mafia boss. The courtroom was her battlefield, and she walked away with the ultimate prize. Did Samantha make the right choice stepping into the dark with Arthur? Or was the $10 million buyout the safer play? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. If you loved this intense mafia romance and courtroom drama, hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, high-stakes storytelling. See you in the next one.